There are stories that slip through the cracks of memory, older than the clay tablets of Sumer, older than the myths that Greece or Egypt would later carry as their own. A question rises like mist over forgotten ruins. What if civilization itself did not begin where we think it did? What if the blueprint of cities, laws, writing, and stars wasn't born in Mesopotamia, but carried into it, whispered from an ancient race whose name was never recorded, whose traces were half erased by the very earth that sheltered them? Across deserts and ocean floors, fragments remain, stones shaped against gravity, languages that seem to echo one another, though oceans divide them, myths of gods descending from the sky, not to rule, but to teach. The Sumerians themselves spoke of gifts given, of wisdom brought from beings they called the Anunnaki. But who or what were these givers of knowledge? Did they come from beyond? Or were they the last heirs of a cycle that had ended before history began? The question does not rest in libraries or museums. It lingers in the silence between myths, in the unexplainable patterns that repeat across continents. To follow it is to step into a deeper current of time, one where beginnings blur into endings, and every ruin hides a forgotten teacher. Welcome to ARCHAEON. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now. I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. The ruins of time rarely speak in clear sentences. They murmur, they hint, they leave behind echoes carved into stone or sealed in clay, waiting for someone to notice the faint vibrations of an older story. The narrative of civilization, as written in textbooks, begins in Sumer. Cuneiform tablets, city-states like Uruk and Lagash, irrigation canals stretching across dry plains, all wrapped in the aura of being the first. Yet even in those tablets there is a confession, one almost never examined closely. The Sumerians themselves said they inherited their wisdom, their kingship, their laws, their astronomy. None of it, they insisted, was born from their own genius. It came from before, from figures described as both human and not, figures who emerged from the deep past and disappeared again, leaving a foundation others would later claim as their own. When scholars uncovered the Sumerian king list, they were struck by the impossible lengths of reigns assigned to rulers before the flood. Some ruled for tens of thousands of years, as though time itself bent differently in those eras. Conventional history waves this aside as myth, a symbolic exaggeration. But if it were only myth, why did the same structure of immense spans of kingship appear in Egyptian records, in Hindu cosmology, in Chinese chronicles of the Yellow Emperor? How is it that so many civilizations that never touched each other preserved the memory of rulers who lived not in human years, but in epochs? A strange rhythm emerges if one listens. A world shattered by catastrophe, knowledge slipping into the hands of survivors, fragments carried into new lands where they germinated again. Archaeologists at sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey confront this same rhythm. 10,000 years before Sumer, hunter-gatherers carved immense pillars, aligned them with stars, filled them with animals frozen mid-movement. There were no villages, no evidence of farming. Yet there was architecture on a scale so vast it contradicted everything known about that age. How could people without agriculture gather the labor, the organization, the vision to create something that still confounds engineers today. Was Göbekli Tepe an echo of an older civilization, built not as a beginning, but as a remembrance? Some researchers have looked further back, to the sudden climate shifts of the Younger Dryas, when ice sheets collapsed, seas rose, and entire ecosystems were swept away. Around 12,800 years ago, a cosmic event, perhaps a comet impact, has been proposed as the cause, scarring the Earth, flooding landscapes, and driving species into extinction. For mainstream science, it was a natural disaster. For myth, it was the flood, the deluge, the cleansing fire and water described in so many traditions. What if those myths are not symbolic tales but memories, passed down like embers through the dark, carrying the story of a world reset? And if that world held a civilization older than Sumer, then the Sumerians were not inventors, but inheritors. Even within their own writing, the Sumerians pointed outward. They said their gods brought knowledge of writing, of measurement, of agriculture. The Anunnaki were not gods in the sense of distant divinity, but beings who walked, who taught, who built. Later ages would reinterpret them, turning them into heavenly figures. But if stripped of metaphor, could they have been remnants of a more advanced human society, refugees of a collapse that left no city intact, only shards of wisdom carried into new soil? Consider the alignment of myths. The Mayan Popol Vuh speaks of gods shaping humans and teaching them. The Egyptian Thoth was the bringer of writing. The Sumerian Enki gave the gifts of knowledge. Even in remote Pacific islands, there are tales of luminous teachers who emerged from the sea, bearing stone tools harder than the local rock, showing the islanders how to carve and build. These are not identical stories, yet they rhyme. Could they all point to the same origin, fragmented as they crossed oceans and generations? The Orthodox timeline insists there was a linear path. Hunter-gatherers to farmers, farmers to cities, cities to states, states to empires. Yet everywhere the evidence resists neat lines. Megalithic structures like Baalbek in Lebanon, with stones weighing over 1,000 tons, were placed with such precision that no modern crane can easily replicate the feat. At Tiwanaku in Bolivia, andesite blocks were carved with machine-like accuracy long before the Inca. The Great Pyramids of Egypt still hold mysteries of alignment and geometry that modern tools struggle to explain. These are anomalies in a narrative that wishes for simplicity. But what if they are not anomalies at all, but survivors, scattered reminders of a world where knowledge once flourished at a scale we can barely imagine? The conflict, of course, lies in interpretation. Mainstream historians argue that humans are ingenious, and with enough time and persistence, remarkable feats can be accomplished without advanced technology or forgotten civilizations. They point to experimental archaeology, where small teams have shown it is possible, though arduous, to move large stones with ropes and ramps. Yet the question lingers. Why would disparate cultures across the globe all create structures that demand such extremes of effort, align them so precisely with celestial markers, and then, curiously, forget how to repeat the feat? Why does knowledge appear suddenly, shine brightly for a moment, and then vanish into shadow? The deeper one listens, the more it feels as though civilization itself is not a straight line, but a pulse, a heartbeat marked by rises and falls. What Sumer recorded as its beginning may have been the latest rise, the moment when an older knowledge resurfaced in fertile soil. If so, then our history is not the story of progress from simplicity to complexity, but of cycles, of ascent, destruction, and rebirth. And what of the beings at the heart of Sumerian lore? The Anunnaki. Were they gods, extraterrestrials as some have speculated? Or were they simply the faces of memory, the last emissaries of a civilization drowned in flood and fire? Their image is carved with wings, with helmets, with tools that resemble modern devices. To one mind, they are divine. To another, they are myth. To yet another, they may be distorted depictions of real figures who bore advanced skills into a world that wasn't yet ready to understand them. Perhaps the greater mystery is not who they were, but why the memory persists. For thousands of years, cultures have clung to the story that knowledge was given, not created. That language, astronomy, farming, the rules of kingship, descended from elsewhere. Is it because it was easier to imagine gifts from gods than to explain human genius? Or is it because, deep in the collective memory, there is an echo of a time when it truly was given, passed down like a torch from hands that no longer exist? The night grows quieter when such questions are spoken. The weight of unremembered ages presses against the edges of thought, reminding us that what we call history may be only the surface of something deeper, more intricate, more fragile. The tablets of Sumer stand like a doorway, pointing back to a civilization they themselves did not claim to have invented. Behind that doorway lies a silence we cannot yet break. But one can sense it, like a rhythm under the earth, waiting, asking, what if everything we believe about beginnings is already a middle? There is a peculiar stillness that lingers over ancient stones, as though they carry a memory too heavy for words. In Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, scholars often describe the sudden appearance of writing, mathematics, and monumental architecture as if humanity had simply leapt forward in brilliance. Yet in other corners of the earth, far from the Tigris and Euphrates, ruins tell stories that resist this neat tale of invention. If Sumer was the beginning, why do older, inexplicable structures continue to surface in places with no direct connection to Mesopotamia? Perhaps they are not outliers at all, but pieces of the same forgotten puzzle. A whisper from an earlier race whose knowledge was scattered like seeds across the continents. The megaliths of Göbekli Tepe already unsettled the timeline, but they are not alone. Off the coast of Japan lies Yonaguni, a submerged monument that some argue is a natural formation, while others insist it bears the marks of human hands. Terraced steps, straight walls, and platforms shaped with uncanny precision lie beneath the sea, dated to nearly 10,000 years ago, a time when mainstream history tells us only small tribes wandered the earth. If it was built before the seas rose, then the image shifts dramatically. Civilizations capable of stone architecture existed before agriculture, their work now drowned beneath the waves of time. In South America, at the high plateau of Pumapunku, blocks of andesite rest scattered like a dismantled machine. Each bears angles and cuts so sharp, so uniform, that modern engineers have admitted difficulty reproducing them with hand tools. The stones seem as if they once belonged to a structure of incredible precision, yet what remains looks less like a ruin and more like fragments blasted apart. Local legends speak of gods who came from the stars, who taught the ancestors how to build. If these were only myths, why do they echo the Sumerian refrain that knowledge came from beyond, from figures who walked in the world, yet did not wholly belong to it. A thread emerges when one moves carefully across these sites. Egypt's pyramids align with Orion's belt. Angkor Wat mirrors the stars of Draco, and the temples of Teotihuacan reflect the layout of the Pleiades. It is as if civilizations separated by oceans all reached for the same map of the heavens, encoding a stellar language into their earthly structures. The Sumerians, too, traced their gods in the stars, charting constellations with a precision that modern astronomy would not fully recover until millennia later. Were these cosmic patterns the inheritance of a shared origin, the last knowledge of a race who understood the rhythms of the skies with a depth that slipped from human grasp when their world ended? The conventional answer is coincidence. Cultures naturally look upward, and the stars invite patterns. But is coincidence enough when the same alignments recur across continents, across ages, carved in stone and myth alike? The more one traces these parallels, the harder it becomes to dismiss them as accidents of imagination. Instead, it begins to feel as though each civilization was recalling something half-remembered, trying to anchor heaven to earth with the tools left to them. Conflict arises not only in the stones, but in the silence around them. Archaeologists who challenge the orthodox timeline are often dismissed, their findings marginalized. Graham Hancock and others have argued for a lost civilization destroyed at the end of the last ice age, pointing to global flood myths and sudden appearances of knowledge as evidence. Critics accuse them of pseudoscience, of romanticizing mystery where none exists. Yet the tension itself reveals something, that the boundary between accepted history and forgotten memory is not a clean wall, but a contested frontier. Each anomaly threatens the neat story, and so it is guarded fiercely. But what if the anomalies are not errors? What if they are windows? The ancient flood narratives deserve such a window. Nearly every culture, from Mesopotamia to the Americas to Oceania, holds a story of a deluge that swept away the old world. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim recounts the flood that destroyed humanity, an event mirrored in the Hebrew Bible and the myths of the Hopi and the Maya. Even in distant lands like India, the tale of Manu saving life upon a boat carries the same essence. Such global repetition is difficult to explain as coincidence alone. Geological evidence of sea level rise after the Ice Age offers one answer, but perhaps myth is more than memory of water. Perhaps it is memory of civilization itself, erased and reborn. The climax of this tension lies not in proving or disproving lost worlds, but in the unease that rises when one considers the possibility. If Sumer did not invent civilization but inherited it, then the story of humanity is not linear progress, but survival after collapse. The figures the Sumerians called Anunnaki may not have been gods from the heavens, but the last emissaries of a dying people, carrying fragments of knowledge across a shattered earth. Imagine survivors watching seas swallow cities, watching fire consume forests, carrying in their minds the geometry of the stars, the craft of stone, the secrets of seed and harvest. Imagine them finding new tribes, new lands, and whispering what they remembered, just enough to begin again. To those who received it, they would seem divine. To us, they appear as myth, and yet the earth still hides their traces. Beneath jungles, deserts, and seas, there may lie whole chapters of a story we have not yet opened. Each time a new site is uncovered, each time a myth aligns with a fragment of geology or astronomy, the silence grows thinner. But the silence does not vanish. It lingers, heavy, reminding us that knowledge is fragile, civilizations mortal, and history far older than the names we attach to it. Perhaps the Sumerians knew this. Perhaps that is why they insisted their wisdom was given, not born. Perhaps they were not claiming divinity, but acknowledging memory, that they stood on foundations they could not see, inheriting the last sparks of a fire that burned in a world now lost. The night presses close when such thoughts arise. One imagines ancient shores swallowed by water, temples crumbling under waves, stars reflected in oceans that carried away whole cultures. Somewhere beneath those waves, beneath the shifting sands, the bones of the first teachers still rest. We cannot yet name them, nor prove their existence, but their presence lingers like a shadow on every myth, on every stone that does not fit the story we were told. What if those shadows are not illusions? What if they are the outlines of a race who came before, leaving us with fragments, waiting for us to remember? And what if remembering is not just about the past, but about the cycle that may come again? The map of origins is never as fixed as it seems. When archaeologists first pieced together the story of Mesopotamia, they believed they had found the absolute dawn of human order. The first cities, the first writing, the first laws. Yet deeper shadows fall across the narrative the further one looks. What if the Sumerians themselves were but one chapter in a much older book, a book whose pages lie buried, scattered, drowned? Each site that does not conform to the tidy sequence of progress becomes another haunting question mark. And questions, once raised, do not easily return to silence. In the Indus Valley, contemporaneous with Sumer, cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa displayed startling sophistication. Gridded streets, advanced drainage, standardized weights, all signs of a society already complete, already matured. There is no evidence of a slow development from villages to such order. They appear suddenly, fully formed, like an idea remembered rather than invented. How could two great civilizations arise almost simultaneously, far apart, with parallels in planning and measurement? Was it chance? Or did both inherit from a source more ancient still, fragments of an inheritance scattered after a forgotten catastrophe? In the sands of Egypt, another mystery waits. The pyramids of Giza stand not as the culmination of a gradual process, but as the apex of skill at the very beginning of Egyptian civilization. Later, pyramids declined in quality, crumbling, collapsing, never matching the precision of those earliest constructions. How could the greatest feats stand at the dawn, only to diminish over time? The Sumerians spoke of wisdom given. Perhaps Egypt too inherited knowledge from predecessors whose existence the desert now conceals. Even more puzzling are the languages that reach back into antiquity. Linguists trace families of tongues, yet some roots remain strangely isolated, their origins unaccounted for. The Sumerian language itself is a linguistic orphan, unrelated to known families, as if it belonged to a vanished people who passed through Mesopotamia like a ghost. The Basque language of Europe, similarly isolated, resists categorization, hinting at the persistence of older strains of human memory. Could these orphaned tongues be remnants of an earlier race, fragments of a lexicon born in worlds now forgotten? Legends speak in riddles, but when read side by side, they seem to converge. In Greek myth, Prometheus steals fire from the gods to gift to humanity. In Mesoamerican stories, Quetzalcoatl brings maize and knowledge. In Polynesian tales, Maui fishes islands out of the sea and bends the sun with cunning. The motifs differ, but the theme is constant. Gifts of civilization descend from outside, bestowed by figures who appear not as kings, but as teachers. Why would so many cultures invent the same story if there was not a seed of memory embedded in them? Could it be that these figures, cast as gods or tricksters, were memories of flesh and blood beings who survived a collapse and bore fragments of civilization to the scattered survivors of humanity? Conflict deepens when these myths are set against the mainstream insistence that civilization grew gradually from simple tribes. Archaeologists point to tools, pottery, and burials that suggest steady progress. And yet, sudden leaps remain. Writing systems appearing in multiple regions without clear precursors, monumental architecture emerging without prototypes, astronomy encoded with a precision baffling for so-called primitive societies. If everything is gradual, where are the missing steps? Why do beginnings appear as completions? The climax of such reflection often arrives when gazing at structures that stand defiantly against explanation. At Baalbek, the trilithon stones weigh more than 1,000 tons each, seated with such precision that even the tiniest gaps resist the insertion of a blade. In Malta, temples over 5,000 years old hold spirals and alignments suggesting a lost cosmology. In the Americas, the Olmec heads, massive stone visages, appear without clear antecedent, as though they too belonged to an older current of knowledge. Each monument whispers of hands guided by something beyond the immediate needs of survival. They whisper of memory, of continuity, of knowledge older than the civilizations credited with creating them. And yet, silence surrounds them. Scholars often prefer to label anomalies as ritual or symbolic, a convenient category for what resists comprehension. Ritual becomes the explanation for anything that does not fit. But what if ritual is a veil we place over things we do not understand? What if the true story is that these structures were functional in ways we cannot yet grasp? Machines of stone, resonant chambers, astronomical markers designed to preserve fragments of knowledge through cycles of destruction and rebirth? The lullaby that follows is uneasy, for it suggests that human history is not secure, not linear, but fragile. Civilizations may rise, achieve wonders, and then vanish, leaving only fragments for later ages to misinterpret as beginnings. If that is true, then Sumer was not the first, only the most fortunate inheritor after the last great erasure. And the true question, haunting the silence of ruins, is whether we too are walking along a cycle that will one day reset, our achievements reduced to myth for those who come after. The stones do not answer. They remain in their quiet gravity, waiting for eyes willing to see beyond the comfort of official narratives. Somewhere in that stillness lies the memory of an ancient race, teachers, survivors, or gods, whose gifts carried civilization into the age we call history, and the shadows they cast still stretch across our world, asking without words, is the story of humanity truly our own? Or are we living in the echoes of another's forgotten dawn? The deeper one travels into the past, the more the ground begins to shift beneath certainty. Every accepted milestone in human history trembles when set against the weight of anomalies that refuse to be silenced. Sumer stands as the celebrated origin, yet the further archaeologists dig, the more fragile that foundation becomes. It is as though the beginning we are told to believe is only the first visible layer of something older, buried in sediment and myth, waiting for its story to be heard again. In Anatolia, near the ancient city of Çatalhöyük, murals painted on walls over 9,000 years ago show obsidian mirrors, leopards in pairs, and geometric designs that seem more abstract than decorative. This was no mere village. It was a society that already understood farming, symbolism, shared architecture, and collective burial practices. Yet it existed millennia before Sumer. If civilization began in Mesopotamia, how do we explain Çatalhöyük, with its complex spiritual imagery and organized dwellings? Was this an isolated spark, or a continuation of a much older fire that never entirely went out? Legends from this same region whisper of submerged lands and vanished peoples. The Black Sea flood hypothesis, proposed by geologists Ryan and Pittman, suggests that rising waters around 5600 BCE swallowed vast settlements along the Black Sea coast. If true, entire cultures may have been drowned, their memory surviving only as fragments in myth. Could this catastrophe have erased evidence of an advanced people, one whose remnants surfaced later in Sumerian memory? Farther east, the ruins of Mehrgar in present-day Pakistan present another enigma. Dating to 7000 BCE, this settlement shows evidence of dentistry, pottery with intricate design, and early trade networks. Here was a culture not stumbling into progress, but already participating in a network of ideas and practices. And just like Çatalhöyük, it appears not as a primitive starting point, but as a society carrying memories of skills already refined. Where did such knowledge come from, if not from a deeper source whose traces lie scattered like broken constellations? The web of these mysteries stretches further still. In Bolivia, Tiwanaku's Gate of the Sun is etched with celestial symbols, believed to mark solstices and cosmic cycles. Its alignment speaks of astronomical understanding far exceeding the needs of survival. In Scotland, the standing stones of Callanish map the lunar cycle with uncanny precision, their arrangement echoing patterns known to Sumerian astronomers thousands of miles away. How could societies divided by vast oceans share such a fixation with the heavens, unless they were echoing teachings from an earlier world? Conflict arises when one considers the official explanations. Historians and archaeologists argue for independent invention. Humans everywhere, curious and observant, devised similar systems to mark time and space. Yet such reasoning does not account for the abruptness with which these skills appear, nor their uncanny similarities. Why would hunter-gatherers, struggling for survival, carve monuments aligned with solstices instead of focusing only on immediate needs? Why does the knowledge surface suddenly, as if remembered rather than discovered? The climax of unease gathers when all these anomalies are viewed together. Ancient flood myths repeated across continents, submerged ruins like Yonaguni that defy geology, linguistic orphans like Sumerian that appear without ancestry, monoliths that surpass the skill of later generations. The pattern suggests not isolated miracles of progress, but the fading footprints of a race who walked before us, carrying knowledge that seeped into the soil of later civilizations. Perhaps they were not superhuman, not gods in the divine sense, but survivors of an earlier cycle whose technology and astronomy appeared miraculous to those who inherited fragments of it. If this is true, then the Anunnaki of Sumer, the Viracocha of the Andes, the Apkallu of Mesopotamia, The civilizing heroes scattered across myths are all masks worn by the same memory. They are not different beings, but different names for emissaries of a lost age, teachers who emerged after catastrophe to seed the beginnings of new societies. To those who encountered them, they would appear otherworldly, their knowledge luminous. To us, they appear as myths, but the stones they left still stand, and yet even myths may carry warnings. The Sumerians insisted that kingship was handed down from heaven, as though governance itself had been an inheritance from an earlier order. But inheritances are fragile, easily lost or corrupted. What if the story of human civilization is not about beginnings at all, but about survivals? What if the torch of knowledge has been passed again and again through fire and flood, each time burning a little dimmer until it flares once more? The lull of night deepens when one reflects on this cycle. Perhaps the story of humanity is not a march from darkness to light, but a pendulum swing between memory and forgetting. Perhaps we are not the first to gaze at the stars with mathematics and myth, not the first to carve meaning into stone. If so, then the ruins we now puzzle over are not foundations, but remnants of something that ended long before our story began. The question lingers like a breath. If civilization did not begin in Sumer, but was carried there by an ancient race, who were they? And how many times has the world forgotten their name? There is a quiet paradox in the way history presents itself. The further back one looks, the more sophisticated the earliest remnants often seem. Instead of finding rough sketches at the dawn and refinement at the end, we encounter peaks of mastery at the very beginning, followed by decline, imitation, and loss. It is as though the first strokes of civilization were not tentative, but already expert, as though the hand that carved them remembered techniques from an older canvas we no longer see. This inversion of progress is one of the strongest whispers suggesting that Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus were inheritors, not inventors, drawing from a reservoir of knowledge left behind by a race that lived through a cycle humanity has since forgotten. In the highlands of Peru, the walls of Sacsayhuaman display stones so massive and irregular that their interlocking joints defy logic. Each block fits with uncanny precision, without mortar, resistant to earthquakes that crumble modern buildings. To this day, stonemasons marvel at how such perfection was achieved. Legends say the work was done by Viracocha's children, luminous figures who walked across the land after a great flood, teaching survivors how to build, how to farm, how to begin again. In the Sumerian tablets, one hears a similar tone, wisdom descending, gifted by figures both human and beyond human, stepping out of myth but anchored in memory. The resonance between these accounts suggests more than coincidence. It suggests inheritance from a common, ancient source. The resonance deepens in myths of sound itself. In Egypt, the god Thoth was said to have used words to shape reality. In Hindu tradition, the primordial syllable Om was the vibration from which the cosmos unfolded. Even the biblical Gospel of John echoes, "In the beginning was the Word." Sound as creation, language as architecture of existence. Could these beliefs be echoes of a time when vibration and resonance were more than metaphors, when ancient builders knew how to harness frequencies to move stone, to shape matter, to preserve memory? Modern experiments with acoustic levitation and sonic resonance hint at possibilities that would appear miraculous in antiquity. What if the monuments we still see were not just built with brute force, but with knowledge of sound and vibration handed down from an older world? The conflict emerges sharply when such ideas touch the edges of accepted science. Archaeologists caution against romanticizing myths, insisting that human ingenuity suffices to explain every feat. Ropes, ramps, manpower. Given enough time, anything is possible. But does such reasoning satisfy when faced with the scale of Baalbek's Trilithon or the polygonal walls of Cusco? Why would countless cultures invest generations in aligning stone with the heavens, in carving blocks that endure earthquakes, if only brute force was at play? The insistence on simplicity feels less like explanation and more like resistance to the unsettling idea that history is cyclical, that humanity has risen and fallen before. Climax builds when we consider the cataclysmic backdrop. Around 12,800 years ago, at the onset of the Younger Dryas, evidence suggests a cosmic impact may have triggered global fires, rapid cooling, and massive floods. This aligns hauntingly with the global deluge myths. Entire coastlines would have been submerged as ice melted, cities swallowed by seas, cultures annihilated. If an advanced race existed then, their remnants would lie drowned, scattered, or reduced to myth. The survivors, few and scattered, would appear godlike to hunter-gatherers who met them, bearers of tools and knowledge from a vanished world. Over millennia, their memory blurred into gods, into luminous teachers, into names carved on tablets and whispered in creation stories. Yet the silence of the earth holds more. Off the coast of India, near Dwarka, divers have found submerged ruins that appear to be planned cities, dated to a time before the earliest known urban settlements. In the Gulf of Kambat, structures lie beneath the water, suggesting that entire chapters of human habitation may have been drowned and forgotten. Could these drowned ruins be fragments of the same world remembered as Atlantis, Lemuria, or other lost lands? Myths dismissively called fantasy may in fact be fractured memories of coastlines swallowed by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age. The lull that follows such revelations is uneasy, for it forces one to consider the fragility of human achievement. If civilizations have risen before, reached heights of knowledge, and then fallen so completely that only whispers remain, what does that mean for our own age? Are we not also vulnerable to fire, to flood, to the whims of a universe vast and indifferent? Perhaps we too are building monuments that will one day puzzle the descendants of survivors, who will wonder if they inherited or invented their world. And so the cycle presses forward. The stones of Sacsayhuaman, the tablets of Sumer, the drowned ruins beneath oceans, they all hint at a race older than we allow ourselves to remember, one that lived through a catastrophe and handed down fragments of its knowledge to seed the civilizations we call first. Their identity is lost, their name erased, but their shadow lingers, stretching across continents carved into myth, waiting in silence for us to ask the question: if they came before us, are we not, in truth, their continuation rather than the first chapter of our own? Civilization, as we know it, often feels like a fragile surface stretched over something older, deeper, and immeasurably vast. Beneath the accepted story of progress lies a hum that refuses to be silenced, a vibration carried through myths, ruins, and unexplainable fragments that resist the neat arrangement of textbooks. When the Sumerians wrote of gods descending to grant kingship, when Egyptians built monuments of impossible geometry, when Andean legends spoke of luminous figures emerging from the sea, they may not have been inventing at all. They may have been remembering, or perhaps recording the last glimmers of a race that came before. If so, then every beginning in history is not a start, but a return. Evidence for such cycles emerges most strikingly in the architecture of forgotten places. Consider the megalithic platforms of Nan Madol, an island city built upon a coral reef in Micronesia. Its massive basalt columns, stacked like giant logs of stone, form canals and temples that appear more like the skeleton of a vanished machine than a human settlement. Local legend says the site was built by two brothers with magical powers who floated the stones across the sea. Archaeologists argue for sheer determination and ingenuity, but the echoes of floating stones appear elsewhere, in Egypt, in Peru, in India. Was this metaphor or memory of an older technique, one that involved not brute force, but an understanding of sound, magnetism, or principles we have not yet reclaimed? The story deepens when one listens to languages of myth. The Sumerians told of the Apkallu, sages sent by the god Enki before the flood to teach humanity arts and sciences. These beings were described as part human, part fish, emerging from the waters to deliver knowledge. Thousands of miles away, in oans of Babylonian lore, one finds the same figure, a fish-cloaked teacher emerging from the sea to civilize mankind. And across the ocean, in Mesoamerican tradition, Quetzalcoatl appears, described as arriving from the east, a bringer of wisdom and crafts. These figures may be masks of the same memory, survivors from an earlier epoch, emerging from seas that swallowed their world, offering remnants of their knowledge to scattered tribes who then preserved the encounter in myth. Conflict grows sharper in the realm of astronomy. Ancient societies fixated on the heavens, encoding alignments in their monuments with such accuracy that modern scholars are still astonished. The Sumerians tracked the movements of planets invisible to the naked eye. The Dogon of Mali, an isolated tribe in Africa, somehow preserved knowledge of Sirius B, a dense white dwarf star undetectable without telescopes, describing its orbit in detail. Critics argue coincidence or contamination by modern contact, yet the precision is unnerving. Why would so many disparate cultures carry fragments of advanced astronomical knowledge unless they inherited them from an earlier race deeply intimate with the sky? The climax of these convergences appears when one considers the flood myths that stretch across every culture, from Gilgamesh's Utnapishtim to the biblical Noah, from Manu in India to Deucalion in Greece, from Hopi traditions to Chinese records of Yu the Great. The story repeats. A catastrophic flood destroys the old world, a few survive, and civilization is rebuilt. Geological evidence of sea level rise, meltwater pulses, and sudden climatic shifts confirm that great floods did occur at the end of the Ice Age. If entire coastlines and cities were drowned, then it is no surprise that survivors became the culture heroes of myth. To those who encountered them, they must have seemed divine, luminous beings emerging from a vanished land. Could these survivors have been the remnants of that ancient race, the ones who seeded Sumer and so many other so-called first civilizations? Yet silence always follows such speculation. Mainstream history insists that myth is symbolic, that human imagination invents gods to explain the unexplainable. And yet, why invent the same stories across continents? Why echo the same catastrophes, the same gifts of wisdom, the same teachers from the sea? The repetition suggests not invention, but transmission. Like a refrain carried through time, these myths may be echoes of a trauma so immense it reshaped memory itself, encoded into culture as both warning and remembrance. The lull of reflection reveals something even more unsettling. Perhaps we are not simply the heirs of one forgotten civilization, but the latest inheritors in a long chain of rises and falls. What if the race that seeded Sumer was itself only a survivor of an even older age, one erased by catastrophe in turn? The pulse of history may not beat once, but endlessly, each cycle producing a civilization, destroying it, and leaving fragments for the next. In this view, humanity is not progressing toward something new, but circling endlessly through memory and forgetting, like a wheel turning in darkness. And so the ruins remain: Nan Madol, Göbekli Tepe, Baalbek, Tiwanaku. Each is a monument not only to human ingenuity, but to something else, something older, something deeper. Perhaps they are not beginnings at all, but fragments of a tapestry woven by a race whose name is lost, whose presence lingers only as gods, sages, and myths. If they came before, then the story of civilization is not ours alone. It is a continuation, a torch passed through fire and flood, carried in trembling hands across the abyss of forgetting. In the quiet of night, such thoughts feel like waves lapping against the shore of memory. They remind us that beneath every ruin lies another ruin, beneath every myth, another memory. And they whisper the same question, one we cannot ignore. What if the first civilization was not human at all, but the shadow of a race whose lessons we live by even now, without knowing their name? Beneath the rhythm of human history lies a deeper resonance, a pulse that seems to echo from a time long before Sumer inscribed its first tablets. The accepted chronicle of our species tells of a gradual climb: hunter-gatherers mastering fire, tribes sowing seed, villages slowly becoming cities. Yet when one surveys the ruins of the world, the story is not of gradual ascent, but of sudden brilliance, as if whole systems of knowledge had been remembered rather than invented. What if the light that first illuminated Mesopotamia was not a spark born of the soil, but a flame carried from another age, from a people whose name we no longer speak? The ruins of Gunung Padang in Indonesia are among the most provocative pieces of this puzzle. Beneath layers of volcanic rock and vegetation lies a megalithic structure stretching back thousands of years further than the first cities of Sumer. Ground-penetrating radar has suggested chambers and terraces hidden deep within the hill, some dated as far back as 20,000 years ago. If true, this would make Gunung Padang the oldest known megalithic site on Earth, existing not merely before civilization as we know it, but before the end of the last ice age. To place such a monument in context is almost impossible within Orthodox history. Yet there it stands, silent, suggesting that organized societies were already building with stone, while conventional wisdom insists humanity still roamed as scattered hunters. In Turkey, not far from Göbekli Tepe, other sites such as Karahan Tepe now reveal similar complexity: pillars, enclosures, subterranean chambers, all dating to the same mysterious era more than 10,000 years ago. Why would hunter-gatherers invest generations of effort into carving stone and aligning structures with celestial bodies? Unless they were not beginning anew, but preserving knowledge from an earlier epoch, echoing skills taught by a race whose memory we now hold only in myth. These ancient echoes resound in the Sumerian stories of the Anunnaki. They were not abstract deities, distant and unreachable, but figures who walked among mortals, who instructed and guided. They brought writing, agriculture, architecture, and astronomy, gifts that appear fully formed in the archaeological record. The Apkallu, the sages dispatched by Enki before the flood, were said to have emerged from water to impart knowledge, only to vanish again when their task was complete. The motif recurs around the globe. In the Andes, Viracocha emerges from Lake Titicaca to teach humanity. In Polynesia, Tangaroa rises from the ocean depths. In Babylon, Oannes, half man, half fish, emerges from the sea each day to teach law and letters. These are not isolated stories. They are overlapping fragments of a singular theme. Knowledge descends, it is bestowed, it is carried, and it comes most often after destruction. Conflict sharpens when one observes how these tales clash with the official timeline. According to mainstream archaeology, complex societies emerge slowly, driven by agriculture and trade. Yet the evidence of these monuments, languages, and myths suggests something else. Sudden surges of knowledge, abrupt mastery of architecture, astronomy, and governance without the long developmental trail one would expect. Writing appears not as scribbles evolving into script, but as fully operational systems, cuneiform in Sumer, hieroglyphics in Egypt, linear A in Crete, all arising in rapid succession. Where are the prototypes, the half-formed scripts that should precede them? Their absence hints that writing too was an inheritance, not an invention. The climax of this inquiry rises when all the pieces are set together. The submerged ruins of Yonaguni and Dwarka, the star-aligned pyramids of Giza and Teotihuacan, the linguistic orphans that defy categorization, the global deluge myths tied to geological cataclysms, the sudden brilliance of ancient cities. Each anomaly alone might be dismissed, but taken together they form a pattern that suggests our history is not singular, but cyclical. Civilizations rise, catastrophes strike, survivors pass on fragments, and the cycle begins again. If so, then the Sumerians were not the architects of civilization, but its custodians, carrying forward what had already been gifted, remembering what others had preserved. Yet beneath this possibility lies an even more haunting thought. What if the race that seeded these fragments was not merely human in the way we understand ourselves? The depictions of the Anunnaki show figures with wings, with tools, with helmets that resemble modern devices. The Apkallu wear cloaks of scales, like beings from another environment. The Viracocha are described as tall, pale, bearded men in a land where such features were unknown. Were these distortions of memory, cultural projections of awe, or faint outlines of a people who were truly other, whether from another place on earth, another branch of humanity, or another realm entirely? The lullaby of the question settles in slowly. Perhaps it does not matter whether these beings were gods, aliens, or survivors. Perhaps what matters is that their memory persists, that across continents and ages humanity insists it was taught, it was guided, it was not alone at its dawn. Myths, like ruins, are not easily erased. They hold the imprint of truths too large to be captured in detail, truths that slip into metaphor but never entirely fade. And so, the silence of Gunung Padang, the shadows of Göbekli Tepe, the whispers of Apkallu and Viracocha all bend toward the same haunting refrain. Civilization may not be our first creation, nor our last. We may be living within a cycle older than any script, walking paths laid down by a race who came before, a race whose legacy is scattered like constellations waiting to be connected. The stars they aligned, the stones they raised, the myths they seeded. These are the traces of their existence, asking us in quiet tones whether we are willing to remember. And in that remembering lies a question that will not let go. If another race shaped the foundations of our world, then who shaped theirs? And how many times has the world forgotten? The ruins that rise from soil and sea are more than remnants of stone. They are fractures in time, fissures that reveal glimpses of an order far older than Sumer. When one looks at them long enough, the accepted chronology of history begins to dissolve. The idea that civilization is a single flame, lit in Mesopotamia and carried onward, falters before the sheer multiplicity of places where the flame appears already burning. What if the fire was never singular, never born in one valley, but passed along from hand to hand across cycles we can no longer trace? What if the Sumerians were not founders but recipients, standing on a foundation left by a race erased from memory but alive in myth? In the Pacific, legends of Mu or Lemuria describe a vast continent swallowed by the ocean. Mainstream scholars dismiss them as fantasy, yet oral traditions from Polynesia to Madagascar carry echoes of lands lost to water. The fragments align with the geological record of rising seas after the Ice Age, when coastlines stretched far beyond their present limits. Entire cultural centers may have been drowned, leaving only the faintest ripples in myth. The survivors, scattered to islands and new shores, may have carried fragments of knowledge that later appeared suddenly in places like Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus. The same rhythm appears in the Andes. The ruins of Tiwanaku and Pumapunku bear stones so precisely cut they resemble prefabricated parts, as if once part of a greater machine. Some blocks weigh hundreds of tons, yet they fit together with the precision of interlocking puzzles. Legends tell of Viracocha, the great teacher who emerged from Lake Titicaca after a flood to restore order, creating humans anew and showing them how to build. The flood, the teacher, the gift of knowledge, the pattern repeats, echoing the Sumerian Apkallu, the Mesopotamian Anunnaki, and the Egyptian Thoth. Different names, different lands, yet the same melody. Could these be refracted memories of the same race, remembered differently by each culture that received their teachings? Conflict arises when one sets these echoes against the framework of orthodoxy. Archaeology insists that complex engineering developed incrementally, yet the earliest monuments often display the highest sophistication, declining in quality as centuries pass. The Great Pyramid of Giza remains unmatched by later attempts. The earliest cities of Mohenjo-Daro show advanced drainage systems lost in later settlements. Even in Sumer, early cuneiform carried complexities that became simplified over time. If human ingenuity alone were responsible, why do we so often see the greatest feats at the beginning, not the end? Why does progress seem inverted, as if knowledge was brightest when first bestowed and dimmed with each generation? The climax of these reflections comes when we trace the flood myths not as stories, but as records of catastrophe. In geological strata, there is evidence of sudden upheaval around the Younger Dryas, when melting ice sheets sent torrents of water across the globe. Rivers swelled, seas rose, and landscapes transformed. To survivors, the world itself must have seemed to end. If a civilization existed then, advanced enough to chart stars and build in stone, its memory would have been obliterated save for fragments carried by those who lived. To those who inherited their teachings, they would appear as gods. To us, they appear as myth. But what if the myths are not exaggerations, but recollections? Plato spoke of Atlantis as a memory from Egyptian priests, describing a mighty land lost to the sea in a single night. In India, texts speak of Viracocha, a city submerged beneath the waves. In Mesopotamia, the flood was so central that kingship itself was said to be lowered from heaven after the waters receded. These parallels cannot easily be dismissed as invention. They may be fragments of one catastrophe, seen through different eyes, recorded in different tongues, but pointing back to the same erasure. The lullaby that follows is not comfort, but awe. If civilization is cyclical, then we live not at the beginning, but in one turn of a wheel that has spun many times before. What we call our history may be only the latest iteration, built on the bones of forgotten ages. The race that carried knowledge into Sumer may itself have been an echo, survivors of an older rise, heirs of teachers who came before. How far back does the chain extend? How many cycles have been lost to sea and sand? The stones will not answer. They remain silent, indifferent, weathered by wind and time. Yet they carry a gravity that cannot be ignored. They ask not for belief, but for listening. And when one listens long enough, the silence itself becomes a question, heavy and unresolved. If we are the heirs of an ancient race, then what of their fate awaits us? Will our monuments too be swallowed by oceans, our stories reduced to myth, our achievements mistaken for miracles by those who come after? The night holds its breath when such thoughts take form. It is as though the earth itself remembers, and in that memory lies a truth both haunting and beautiful. Nothing is ever truly new, only remembered. Civilization, like the tide, rises and falls, and always, somewhere in the depths, there lingers the presence of those who came before, waiting for us to remember the cycle we are already living. The night of history is full of echoes, voices carried across oceans of time, their words no longer clear, their meanings blurred, yet their presence undeniable. When we trace those echoes back, through Sumer and Egypt, through India and the Andes, through the drowned cities beneath rising seas, a pattern begins to reveal itself. It is not the straight line of progress that textbooks insist upon. It is a circle, a pulse, a rhythm of rise and collapse, inheritance and forgetting. If Sumer was the cradle, it was also a grave marker, carrying the memory of something older, a civilization that passed on fragments of its wisdom before vanishing into silence. Among the most persistent of these fragments is the obsession with the stars. From Mesopotamia's meticulous planetary charts to the alignments of pyramids in Egypt and Mesoamerica, from Stonehenge to Nabta Playa in the Nubian desert, humanity's first monuments reach upward. They are less about shelter than about orientation, as if the survivors of a forgotten age needed to re-anchor themselves to the heavens. The Sumerians named constellations with uncanny precision, as though they inherited an astronomical map already complete. Egyptian temples aligned with Sirius and Orion. The Maya tracked Venus with obsessive accuracy, recording cycles invisible to the naked eye. Why this global fixation on the sky at the very dawn of civilization? Was it reverence or remembrance? If the race that seeded civilization endured a catastrophe, perhaps they turned to the stars as both guide and warning. In myths across the world, cosmic events are tied to floods and fires. The Norse spoke of Ragnarok, when the sky would break and stars would fall. The Hopi remembered the blue star Kachina that signaled the end of worlds. Ancient Chinese texts describe stars colliding, flames sweeping the land. Even the Sumerian tales of Anunnaki entwined heavenly beings with earthly kingship, as if memory of survival and memory of the cosmos could not be separated. Could the obsession with celestial cycles be the echo of a race who watched the sky for the return of the same catastrophe that once erased them? Conflict with orthodox views deepens here. To scholars, ancient astronomy is explained as practical. The sky was a calendar, a tool for agriculture. Stars guided planting, harvest, and navigation. Yet the precision often exceeds necessity. The alignments of monuments to precessional cycles spanning 26,000 years serve no immediate agricultural need. The Dogon's knowledge of Sirius B, the Mayan long count calendar, the Sumerian obsession with a 12th planet. These belong not to subsistence farming, but to a cosmology of survival. Why would the earliest civilizations encode knowledge of vast cosmic cycles unless they were remembering the conditions of a past destruction? The climax of this thought emerges when one imagines the last days of that forgotten civilization. Picture the survivors watching skies darkened by debris, floods rising, fire sweeping forests, continents breaking beneath waves. To preserve their memory, they carved the heavens into stone, aligned monuments with the stars, and taught the next generations to remember. Over millennia, their warnings became myths, their maps became rituals, their teachers became gods. And in Sumer, those gods were written as Anunnaki, givers of kingship, bearers of knowledge, shadows of a race whose catastrophe we only half recall. Even language carries their ghost. Sumerian, a linguistic isolate, has no known relatives, no clear evolution. It appears as if it were imported whole, written and spoken by a people already versed in abstraction. The same mystery surrounds the Basque language in Europe, the Etruscan tongue in Italy, and the Rongorongo script of Easter Island. These fragments are like orphaned voices, disconnected from the lineages we can trace, belonging perhaps to older migrations, older survivors, older teachers. What if these tongues are the last traces of that ancient race, their lexicons fading even as their myths endure? The lull of this reflection is heavy. If we are living in the echoes of a forgotten race, then all our monuments, all our sciences, are not the beginning but a continuation. Perhaps the torch of civilization has been passed many times, and each time it flickers, it risks being lost. What we call progress may be only recovery, and what we call invention may be remembrance. And if the pattern holds, then catastrophe is not an exception, but a law. Floods will return. Fires will return. Civilizations will fall, and survivors will whisper again of gods who came from the sea, from the stars, from before. The silence of ruins reminds us that nothing endures unchanged. Sumer fell, Egypt fell, the Indus fell, the Maya fell. Each rise carries within it the certainty of decline. Yet in each decline, something is carried forward, an alignment, a myth, a word, a stone cut against gravity. These are the fingerprints of those who came before, a race whose presence we feel but cannot name. They are the ones who turned the sky into memory, who taught kings to rule, who gave us words and numbers, who disappeared into catastrophe, yet linger in myth. And so the question grows sharper, more unsettling. If we are living within their cycle, are we destined to repeat their fate? Will our own cities one day lie beneath waves, our machines rust into silence, our languages become isolates, our myths retold as tales of gods who once walked among mortals? And if so, will we too be remembered only in fragments, as the shadows of a race that came before? History often speaks as if it were a straight road, beginning in the fertile plains of Mesopotamia and stretching toward the present in one continuous ascent. Yet when one looks closely, the road twists and doubles back, littered with the ruins of civilizations that appear too suddenly, too complete, as though they had not walked the path from darkness into light, but had stepped into it from somewhere else. Sumer is celebrated as the birthplace of writing, of law, of kingship, but the closer we listen to the words of its own people, the more they seem to insist that they were not the first. Their stories, carved into clay, carry the refrain of memory, that their wisdom was given, their foundations inherited, their beginnings not their own. One of the most striking pieces of this memory lies in the Sumerian king list, where reigns stretch back into spans of tens of thousands of years before the Great Flood. Modern scholars dismiss these figures as exaggeration, symbolic rather than historical. Yet the same pattern appears elsewhere. In the Indian yugas, vast epochs of time measured in tens of thousands of years, in Egyptian king lists that record reigns stretching into the mythical past, in Mayan cycles that track cosmic spans far beyond human lifetimes. Are these simply metaphors? Or are they the shadows of another measure of time, remembered from a race whose existence unfolded in scales we no longer understand? The rhythm of collapse and inheritance returns in every corner of the world. In the Mediterranean, Minoan Crete flourished with writing, palaces, and trade routes centuries before Greece rose, only to vanish in catastrophe. In China, ancient texts describe a succession of heavenly dynasties before the age of known emperors. In the Americas, the Olmecs appear suddenly with colossal heads, advanced iconography, and astronomical knowledge, without clear precursors. Each of these civilizations looks less like a beginning and more like a continuation, as if the soil of human history kept yielding shoots from the same buried root. Conflict grows more intense when we ask why so many cultures preserve flood narratives as their central myth. The Sumerian deluge, Utnapishtim's survival, is mirrored almost identically in the story of Noah. In India, Manu survives a flood by building a boat guided by a great fish. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha repopulate the earth after waters subside. In Native American traditions, great floods wash away former worlds. Even in remote Polynesian myths, the theme repeats. Geology confirms that seas did rise dramatically at the end of the last ice age, swallowing coastlines and altering continents. What if the universality of these myths is not coincidence, not symbolic morality tales, but testimony? Survivors of a real catastrophe, scattered across the earth, carrying fragments of memory into every culture. The climax of this possibility is staggering. If there was a civilization before the flood, then Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus were not creations but restorations. The beings remembered as Anunnaki, Apkallu, Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl may not have been gods from the stars, but the last survivors of that drowned world. To shattered tribes living in a desolate landscape, their knowledge of architecture, astronomy, and writing would have appeared divine. To us, their memory is distorted through myth, but it carries a consistency too precise to ignore. Across oceans and ages, the same motifs appear: luminous teachers, floods of destruction, gifts of civilization, sudden vanishings. Even the stones themselves suggest continuity. At Baalbek in Lebanon, the trilithon blocks weigh more than 1,000 tons each, fitted into a platform whose scale dwarfs anything required for Roman or later structures. In Egypt, the Osirian at Abydos lies sunken beneath the temple complex, its granite blocks far older and more massive than the sandstone buildings above. In Peru, the walls of Sacsayhuaman and Ollantaytambo show craftsmanship that the Inca themselves admitted they inherited. Everywhere, the earliest layers of construction are the most sophisticated, as if the further back we look, the closer we come to the work of the first race. And yet, silence greets these anomalies. Scholars frame them as mysteries of engineering, coincidences of myth, exaggerations of memory. But the silence itself speaks. It is the silence of what does not fit, what cannot be contained within the official story. Perhaps the reason so many cultures insist that knowledge was given, that kingship descended, that gods walked among men, is because the truth of inheritance is more unsettling than the myth of invention. To invent is to be secure in progress. To inherit is to realize we walk upon ruins, and that we, too, may fall. The lull of reflection turns these thoughts inward. If civilization is cyclical, then what we call our history is only one turn of a wheel that has spun many times. If another race carried knowledge across catastrophe, then our greatest achievements may not be unique, but echoes. And if floods have erased worlds before, then the fragility of our own becomes clear. We too may be reduced to myth, our cities submerged, our machines forgotten, our voices surviving only as whispers of gods who once built towers and spanned the earth. The question hovers, unresolved. Are we the first to walk this path, or only the latest? And if others came before, who carried fire into the darkness after their fall, who passed the torch into Sumer's waiting hands, then how many times has the world been remade? And how many more times will it be? There is a haunting symmetry in the way myths, ruins, and fragments of forgotten knowledge circle around one another. Each culture insists upon its own origins, yet beneath the surface their stories are less about beginnings than about inheritances. The Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Maya, the Vedic sages, all of them speak of wisdom descending, of gods or teachers who walked among mortals and left behind the spark of civilization. These are not isolated inventions, but a pattern, a chorus of memory repeating across continents and centuries. The question that rises from this chorus is as vast as it is unsettling. If humanity has been taught, then who were the teachers, and how many times have they returned? The Sumerians remembered the Anunnaki, beings who bestowed kingship and law. The Egyptians remembered Thoth, the god who gave writing and mathematics. The Greeks remembered Prometheus, who brought fire to humankind. The Andean peoples remembered Viracocha, who emerged from the waters after the flood to teach survival. Even in remote Oceania, legends tell of luminous figures who rose from the sea, bringing gifts of agriculture and navigation. Everywhere the refrain repeats, knowledge comes from without, not from within. Could it be that these figures were not gods in the divine sense, but emissaries of a race that survived cataclysm after cataclysm, bearing fragments of an earlier civilization that once spanned the globe. In the archaeological record, one finds the same paradox. The earliest monuments are often the most precise, the most enduring, the most inexplicable. Later structures decline in sophistication, suggesting not progress, but memory fading. The Great Pyramid of Giza remains unmatched by later dynasties. The megaliths of Baalbek and Tiwanaku stand beyond the reach of those who later claimed them. Even Göbekli Tepe, deliberately buried, seems less like the start of something than the last breath of a world already ending. These monuments whisper of continuity, of a civilization that left traces across the earth before vanishing, its remnants later misattributed as beginnings. Conflict with orthodoxy arises most sharply here. Scholars defend the narrative of gradual development, stone to copper, copper to bronze, bronze to iron, a steady march toward complexity. Yet this does not explain the abrupt appearances of writing systems, the sudden mastery of astronomy, or the precision of early architecture. It does not explain why the earliest evidence often appears most advanced, as though humanity began not with fumbling attempts but with a legacy it barely understood. If Sumer was truly the first, why do we find echoes of civilizations in Turkey, Indonesia, Peru, and the deep ocean that predate it by millennia? The climax of this reflection arrives when one considers the scale of forgetting. At the end of the Ice Age, seas rose more than 100 meters, swallowing coastlines that had been home to countless people. If cities had stood there, they are now hidden beneath waves, their stories surviving only as Atlantis, Mu, Lemuria, Viracocha. Geological evidence confirms the floods. Myths confirm the memory. Survivors, scattered to new lands, carried fragments of knowledge that became the seeds of Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus. The Anunnaki may not have descended from the heavens, but emerged from the ruins of drowned lands, bearing with them the last fire of a world now erased. But even this is not the end. For what if those survivors themselves were only inheritors of an even older cycle? The king lists of Sumer, the yugas of India, the Mayan long count, all speak of ages stretching back tens of thousands of years, of worlds destroyed and reborn. What if civilization is not a singular story but a repeating one, a wheel turning endlessly through creation and destruction? Each time, a race rises, masters the stars and the stones, only to be undone by flood, fire, or cosmic accident. Each time, a few survivors carry knowledge forward, remembered as gods by those who inherit it. Each time, the torch flickers but is not extinguished. The lull that follows such thoughts is profound. It is not only the possibility of forgotten civilizations that unsettles, but the inevitability of cycles. If others have risen and fallen before, what does that mean for us? Our machines, our satellites, our sprawling cities may seem unassailable, yet so too did the monuments of those who came before. A single cataclysm could reduce our age to silence, leaving only scattered myths for those who come after. Perhaps even now, we live not at the summit of history, but at another fragile crest in a rhythm older than we dare to imagine. And so the story closes not with certainty, but with a question, the same question that has lingered since the first myths were told and the first ruins were unearthed. If civilization did not begin in Sumer but came from an ancient race, then what was that race, and where did it come from? Were they humans of an earlier cycle, advanced beyond our comprehension, or were they something other, something we can only glimpse through the distortions of memory. The ruins do not answer. The stars do not answer. Only the silence remains, heavy and unresolved. In that silence lies the final image, waves rolling endlessly against forgotten shores, stars moving through cycles older than time, and the faint echo of voices that whisper still in our myths. Perhaps they are gone forever. Or perhaps, in ways we cannot yet see, they are still with us. The night closes around the thought, and the world grows hushed, leaving us with the weight of a question that may never end. What if the first civilization was not ours at all, but theirs? And what if we are only the next verse in their unending song?